this day with headlines like these: war in Europe, amongst others. Russia had launched its war on Europe. There's never a good time for war, but Putin's timing was brutal, especially for the global economy. Just when countries assumed they were out of the woods and had started to intensify efforts to spur economic growth, as well as tame COVID-induced inflation, a war begins. A war that today turns 3 years old. From the surge in political and economic fragmentation to the rise in protectionist policies, or is it the toll across markets and currencies? And even a well-known football club, blue is a color, Chelsea is a club, right, struggled to adjust to new ownership because it had to distance itself from previous Russian oligarch owners. On today's special, we speak with experts across different lines and touch on the geopolitics, energy security, inflation, capital markets, and commodities. How hard were these macroeconomic shocks, and what is to come? Is an end in sight? I am Joanna Mustapha, your host on today's special, Russia-Ukraine war, 3 years in. Needless war, who wins? But first, we bring you a special report detailing the events leading up to what many have described as a needless war.
Three years of relentless war. What was once expected to be a short campaign has turned into a grinding conflict with no clear end in sight. Today, Ukraine mourns its dead, while both sides count the cost. The toll has been staggering. Western estimates suggest nearly 500,000 casualties, Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, civilians caught in the crossfire, children orphaned. Towns across the country, once bustling, are now unrecognizable. On this, the third anniversary of the invasion, both leaders remain defiant. President Zelensky says Ukraine will fight until every inch of land is reclaimed. President Putin vows Russia will not back down, painting the war as a battle against Western aggression. But the conflict has rippled far beyond the battlefield. It has reshaped Trump's rhetoric, including false claims Ukraine started the war, has alarmed European allies.
A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Gotta move fast.
Trump's criticism of US aid to Ukraine and calls for a negotiated peace on terms many see as favorable to Moscow could reshape Western strategy entirely. In Ukraine, Trump's comments are seen as a threat. Without firm US backing, the country fears it could be forced into a settlement that cedes territory to Russia.
Europe just needs to come together.
Zelensky is facing pressure to sign a deal to hand the United States preferential access to Ukraine's mineral deposits. Trump wants Ukraine to give US companies access as compensation for the tens of billions of dollars of aid delivered under his predecessor, Joe Biden. But Ukraine is seeking security guarantees from the United States in exchange for signing away precious rights to vast amounts of its natural resources and critical minerals. European leaders, meanwhile, are scrambling. France, Germany and the UK have pledged to increase military aid, whilst urging Washington to stay the course. But behind closed doors, there's anxiety about what a second Trump presidency could mean.
We look forward to speaking to President Trump more about this. We're very, very clear. There must be a role for Ukraine. It must be at the heart of these negotiations. Of course they want peace, but they will need security guarantees.
3 years on, the war has left deep scars, not just on Ukraine and Russia, but across the world. And now peace seems as much a political puzzle as a military one. The next few months, shaped by shifting power in Washington, could determine how this war ends, or if it drags on for years to come. For News Central, I'm Afia Hagan.
All right, that report was put together by our international correspondent, Hafia Hagan, who now joins us, of course, for the first panel on geopolitics. We also have joining us for this first panel, we have Professor Olu Ojedokun, the Vice Chancellor, Protestant University of Rwanda. It's a pleasure to have you in, Prof. And joining us from Miami is Global Marketing Executive Amanda Wolverton. Good morning at your end, Amanda.
Good morning.
All right, let's begin with you, Prof. Right? Some have dubbed this conflict, of course, a needless war. Earlier in January, we had Trump's envoy to Ukraine. They had said that this war will end this year that has gone on for 3 years, or some will say 11 years, depending on how you calculate it. Their goal is to end this war within the first 100 days. That's about April. Would you say, with what we have seen so far, that they are on track to achieving that, especially with the latest moves from Trump, right? We've had him somewhat try to change the narrative, painting Zelensky as a dictator. So, I mean, what could be his play here? And are they on track to meeting up with their 100 days goal?
Well, I think there's a factor we need to consider. If it was just a question of the USA and Russia, then yes, possibly. But there are other factors at play, and there are other partners in play. We have the European Union, and of course, Ukraine is the crucial factor concerned. I mean, before today, when all the allies, or some of the allies rather, met in Europe, in Brussels, and of course, many of the other states visited Kiev today, you would have thought maybe they were on the way. But with Britain promising 4.5 billion in terms of military aid to Ukraine, EU promising 3.5 billion euros in terms of grant for same, and then the Canada also, deciding to unfreeze $5 billion of Russian assets so that Ukraine will be able to use it for their military defense. So yes, USA was a significant factor, and they could initially or in the past have determined the cause of this conflict. But it's beyond the USA now. There are other partners in play, other factors in play, and there are other indices to watch. Therefore, I think except the Europeans and Ukraine itself comes to the table or come line up behind the US, it's very unlikely, except Russia is going to give up. And I don't see Russia giving up anytime soon.
And you've highlighted the need to have EU at the table as well as Ukraine. They haven't been at the table so far with the latest meeting in Saudi Arabia last week. I want to stop the war. I want to save lives. Those were Trump's words. Let's speak to the US's stakes in this war and what they stand to gain or perhaps even lose. What is in it for US, right? What is in it for Trump, right? And other stakeholders in this war, and with a potential end in sight?
In the past, one would have said that what was in it for them was their continual leadership of the so-called free world. Because if you look at after the Second World War, what happened was that US role in Europe and indeed in Asia Pacific was cemented as the leaders of the free world. In terms, they had an alliance called the NATO, and that was to guarantee not just the freedom of the Europeans, but also guarantee that the USA was never again dragged into the center of war in Europe. And so they would have gained relative peace, relative stability, from that point of view. But if you look at it from Trump's point of view, he sees it in raw terms, in terms of precious or earthly minerals, in terms of transactional relationship. And it's not so much tied to any such ideals, the ideals of the 1940s, which has predominated for the last 70 years. So you may argue, if you are going to support what Trump is saying, that there's no immediate gain for the US, other than for the fact that there will be some peace and that NATO will not be drawn into a war. Of course, for the Ukraine, the immediate benefit to Ukraine is that they get to keep more than 20% of their territory, which they are fighting for, and they get to keep Russia at bay. And for Russia, of course, it's a question of ego. Russia had an empire, and it was lost during the collapse of the Cold War. And since then, the USSR has been trying to regain, what it has lost. And of course, it seems as if Ukraine was their first test. Well, they've had some minor tests, but of course, Ukraine was to be the major test before they went also after other areas. So in terms of gain, I think if the war stops now, what the world gains is peace and maybe some economic stability, and maybe countries even like Nigeria will begin to benefit from cheaper grain prices and so on and so forth.
I mean, we'll see. I mean, what's it for Nigeria and perhaps Africa? But we, like you have pointed out, Trump is a businessman. We'll see what he gets out of this situation as well. Coming down to you, Amanda, right? A number of alliances have been formed in the course of this war. How would you say some of these alliances and perhaps that have been formed and broken along the course of 3 years has perhaps deepened geopolitical divides? How would you say it has led to further fragmentation and formation of different trade blocs?
Very good question. I think that the situation have been changing really fast for the last couple months. That what we thought that certain blocs are either strengthened or, for example, NATO and BRICS have been really all of a sudden thrown into a different situation. For example, Trump recently talked about inviting Russia into G7, and then also the apparently strengthened relationship between Russia and China might evolve over time because of the new development with the negotiation between United States and Russia. So what I can say is what we believed, for example, that the situation in 2024 might be completely different in 2025. So the only thing is that we need to consider is that the geopolitical landscape is changing really fast in 2025. So what we assumed that the strength of NATO and the alliance between the BRICS might evolve into something different in 2025. So what the opportunities open for countries in Africa, for example, Nigeria, is that in the past, a lot of geopolitics were played by blocs, but now I think it's going to open multilateral relationships and development. So I think that opens a slew of opportunities for countries like Nigeria that we could potentially contribute and add value to the whole play.
All right. And before we let you go, looking at the role that different countries have played in this war, their rhetoric, the sides they have taken somewhat, and the commentary they have made, or even just watching from afar, how would you say certain countries and regions have been branded? For example, Africa. What's the perception of Africa in the course of this war, in the aftermath of this war? United States, Russia, and Ukraine. How would you say these countries have been branded in the course of the war?
I think there's definitely perceptions in Europe and in the United States, and those perceptions about the war are dramatically different. And then even in giant countries, mega countries like China. So the perception of the war, depending on who you ask, or what role the different countries have played in this war are dramatically different. So it's hard to get a holistic story unless you have a holistic picture. I think what is really good at this moment is, just like the professor earlier brought up, is that hopefully peace will come to reality, and the multilateral relationship among different continents and different countries will become more of a reality, and which opens more opportunities for countries in Africa, for example, like Nigeria, to play a bigger role, to step up in the global geopolitics landscape. In the past, most of the roles are being played by blocs, like what we said, G20, G7, as well as NATO, as well as BRICS.
Right.
But with the potential stop of the war and multilateral relationships, I think countries in Africa will have an opportunity to step up.
All right, thank you very much for that, Amanda. Tying things together on this segment with you, Prof. Russia, Ukraine, 3 years in, who wins? Who would you say is benefiting from this war, and what are the prizes?
Really, in the last few days, Russia sold 100 tons of Russian gold. That's marks of desperation to me. But having said that, Ukraine basically has lost more than half of its, Ukraine has lost 20% of its sovereign territory. They took back most of it, but 14 million people have been displaced. $56 billion of damage to the environment. 500 billion but that's from the major oil in Russia, 5% of its value. That's come from Russia down by 700.
All right.
Together.
It appears we're having some network glitches there, but I think the point has been made there. Professor Olu Ojedokun, the Vice-Chancellor of Protestant University of Rwanda, joining us from Rwanda there. And of course, thank you very much, Amanda Wolverton, joining us from Miami, a global marketing executive. That brings this session to a close. When we do return, of course, we'll be focusing on oil and gas, energy security. How has it been affected by the war? Stay tuned. Some, of course, have dubbed this conflict between Russia and Ukraine as a war over resources, even just taking a look at Trump's interventions. And some have also dubbed it, highlighted the ability of Russia to maintain its monopoly on oil and gas supply to Europe as being another subtle prompt for this war. Most recently, we saw Zelensky shut off Russian gas taps, refusing to renew the transit contract and ending the flow of Russian gas through Ukrainian territory. We're going to explore, of course, the energy aspect of this conversation, the oil and gas part of this conversation. And joining us all the way from Abuja, we have the Managing Director of Mark and Synergy, Dosu Odekunle. It's great to have you in, Dosu.
Same here, and thank you for having me, Joanne.
Always a pleasure. Now, aside from the more obvious Ukraine's potential membership of NATO, there's also, been a prompt for the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's a less obvious one, right? Looking at the land Ukraine has annexed and sought to claim. Let us into how Ukraine was becoming a growing threat to Russia's gas monopoly in Europe.
Right. So, I mean, they have, as with all nations and their neighbors, there's always history that goes back, way back. And Ukraine has always been the conduit to which Russia has flowed its oil. So, there are pipelines that are built into Europe, majorly like veins that run from Russia, and they pass through Ukrainian land. And Ukraine used to charge Russia like a transit fee for gas to get into the other parts of Europe. And things used to happen. There used to be, in quote, like stolen volumes were missing, if I can put it that way. And it used to cause issues in the past with Russia. And then Russia looked to, look for alternative routes. That was through Turkey, and then a direct one through the Northern Sea to Germany, just to, deal with the Ukraine issue. So that had always been a problem. It had grown over the years. And then Russia used to still pump through Ukraine. And, obviously they were having spats, small issues. As way back as, the first, the annex of Crimea, that was in 2014. Those issues added to, the flow of gas through Ukraine. And, obviously, Ukraine trying to hold on to that source of revenue from Russia. But that has all changed. Russia has found other ways to move its gas, and Europe has found other ways to gain gas. I think Ukraine is probably the one losing out in this structure at the moment. Ukraine does have natural gas that it produces itself, but that has been on a decline since I think the late 70s and early 80s.
Okay, interesting. So, in what ways would you say Russia's position as a major player in oil and gas, how would you say that has served as leverage for them? And some will even say a weapon, that they have weaponized this, right, in this war. Is that what, would you say is gagging Europe in mediating in the conflict?
Okay, I mean, yes, I mean, Russia is them against the world, so they're using the tools they have to fight, this fight. It's not just Ukraine they're fighting, but they're also fighting the West, and those that have put sanctions against them. So this weaponization of energy is not the first time. In the 80s, under Gorbachev, what Russia used to do was, very aggressive. Someone was going to get independence. Someone was going to, express some certain level of liberty. Russia would restrict, gas and energy supplies to them aggressively. Now it is just hidden under economic stories. Oh, the market moved here and blah, 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 blah. So for this war, what Russia has essentially done in terms of weaponizing their energy, Europe suffered the first bout, when gas was stopped for a while, and there was a heavy winter. I remember this started in February, exactly 3 years ago, and Europe were the first victims, and that led to a spike in energy. And interestingly, the timing couldn't have been worse. Remember that in COP26, I believe, had just said they want to shut down fossil fuel investments and shift into net zero was the target, and the world ran with it. So investments for oil and gas, were off the table. It was not even transition energy was not even a discussion. It was, they would kill off all forms of fossil fuels, and then the war starts, and then Europe has a tough winter, and Russia weaponized it. They used it to the best of their ability, cutting off supplies and also charging extra for what was flowing through the other areas.
Of course, they used what they had, or they're using what they have at the moment. Thank you for that, Dosun. Let's come to Afua Hagan, our international correspondent. And in terms of the cost of this war right now, Dosun has highlighted the fact that it seems to be Russia, or it is Russia, against the rest of the world. How has Russia held up, in this fight, especially with the cost of this war?
To this war, Joanna. I mean, there's first of all the human cost of the war. 500,000 people, whether that is troops, civilians, have been killed or injured in this war. And that's just the estimates that we have. Those estimates could be much higher because of the methods of counting people that have been killed, people that are buried under the rubble. Let's look at the infrastructure costs of this war. You have entire cities like Mariupol that have been pretty much leveled. I mean, 3 years ago today, we had Kiev that was trying to be taken by Russian soldiers, and huge amounts of damage done to Kiev as well. I mean, today you have a conference taking place there featuring world leaders. Life still goes on, but like I said, you do have some cities like Mariupol, like Bakhmut, that have been absolutely leveled. In early 2024, it was estimated that the damage to those cities, the damage to the infrastructure, was about $500 billion. And to rebuild those cities and to restructure them, including Kiev, could be up to $1 trillion as well. And where does that money come from? That's the real question. Does that come from aid from the United Nations or from the EU? We know that America is talking about possibly withdrawing its support. Let's talk about the economic collapse. If we talk about agriculture, the backbone of the Ukrainian economy, that has been devastated. Industrial output, of course, has plummeted as well. And like I said, those reconstruction costs looking about $1 trillion. So there's many costs to this war, to this invasion that Russia hosted against the Ukraine. And remember as well, those costs will come to Russia also. We've got sanctions, new sanctions announced today by the United Kingdom. You've had sanctions throughout this 3-year phase of the war as well. And those sanctions hurt the Russian economy at first, although the Russian economy has grown afterwards. And so, yes, like I said, many, many costs to this war.
Indeed. And I mean, cost of the war, cost to rebuild as well. Thank you so much for that, Afia. Coming back to you, Dosun, right? Oil prices, right? We know that some are saying, and it's been interesting to get your projections, oil prices are coming down. Trump's mantra has been drill, baby, drill. Russia is already selling oil at a discount. So how will they can they afford to continue to fund this war? It appears you're muted. Doesn't. Right.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So regardless of the price of crude, as long as it doesn't drop below the sanction prices, I think Russia should be good. So when America capped, part of the sanctions capped Russian prices to $60 per barrel, crude is still doing 74, that's Brent. And so it's not really affecting them. What has actually happened is that the flow went elsewhere. And so they're actually able to still generate a lot of money. They're currently the largest supplier of crude to China, and then followed by that by India. So where this oil used to go in all over Europe and as far as the Americas, that isn't happening anymore. But Asia is still in bed with Russia. And then Russia developed that channel to sell to them. Another thing that America did was, the sanctions that were imposed was the banning of Russia from SWIFT financial system to freeze their assets.
Right.
Russia went in with theirs, I think SPSF or so, thereabout. They created that, and they're actually able to trade with China and India and other smaller parties. So they're still selling crude. As the last speaker said, the economy actually expanded. It shrunk at first in the first year, and then it continued to increase. So what did Russia do? They sold more of their crude at that lower price, and therefore they were actually able to keep on funding the war and continue to prosper as a nation. There's still damage, but they do have a lot of money coming in. Russia is currently the third largest producer in the world in terms of crude output.
I mean, it takes a lot of strategy to hold, that position. But obviously, the tag for this special is a needless war. Who wins? So what assets, what markets? We know that this war has somewhat reshaped, the oil and gas trade and the markets. So who emerges a winner in this war, or who wins? Who benefits? What assets benefit? What countries benefit from this war from an oil and gas perspective? Dosu.
Sorry, I didn't hear that question. I think I was frozen for a second there.
All right. I was, referring to what assets or what countries benefit from an energy perspective from this war.
Okay, from an energy perspective, I'll say China and India have profited the most. Quietly, Saudi. I don't think I want to go into that, but Saudi has profited. But the two greatest beneficiaries are, as countries, is China and India. Then the other markets that have profited is the shipping market. So if those in the trading space will have heard of shadow fleets. So these are oil and gas tankers who switch off their radars and how they are tracked, and they're actually able to sail to Russia and move the oil. Now, because they're moving in the shadows, in quote, they made a lot of money because it's illegal for them to have gone there. And the same thing for banking lines. A lot of money was moved into the Middle East and into pseudo accounts for Russian money to move out. So a lot of people did benefit. And in this cycle, even though they're not the energy space, I would say the warmongers, the guys who are making weapons and tech, especially the cybersecurity level and physical weapons, they probably profited the most from this war.
Interesting perspective there, Dosu, and of course that's all happening on the ground. Thank you very much, Dosu Odukunle, joining us from Abuja, and of course our international correspondent, Afua Hagan. All right, that brings an end. Yes, it's a pleasure to have you in. That brings an end to this session focusing on oil and gas. Up next, the part that hit us the most, the rise in commodity prices, inflation and currencies as well. That's up next on today's special Russia-Ukraine war 3 years in. Stay tuned. All right, there are not so many ways you can make an already difficult situation worse. Imagine coming fresh out of a COVID lockdown and walking straight into a war between major commodity producers or key produce like wheat, oil and gas, fertilizer, amongst others. The macroeconomic shocks hit hard across markets. And now for a well-rounded conversation on its effect on CPI, currencies, and capital markets, we have joining us in the studio, Dr. Ifeanyi Ubah, global macro strategist and head of investment research at Commercio Partners. Great to have you in.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, we also have Dumebi Oluwole, senior economist at Steers. It's a pleasure to have you in.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and of course the Executive Secretary, Fertilizer Producers and Suppliers Association of Nigeria, in person of Gideon Negodu. Hope I got that right.
Yeah, you did.
All right, let's get into the conversation. And I'm coming to you, Dumebi. Obviously, some may say it's hard to differentiate, the effects on inflation from, the one that was COVID-induced and that was war-induced. But how have you been able to do so? And what countries and commodities were most affected by this war?
I would say I'll start from the latter part. So countries that were most affected and the commodities that were most affected. Countries most affected were primarily developing economies and emerging markets, simply because they are more vulnerable to external shocks like the COVID war, like COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war. So they import a lot of commodities from the global market, and as such, due to the war where we saw an increase in commodity prices, we saw a lot of those countries negatively impacted. Nigeria was also one of those countries. But in terms of commodities, look at commodities like grain prices, wheat prices, corn prices. Cocoa prices also increased. You also look at oil and gas prices significantly increased. Then you also look at other energy commodities like hydrogen also increased, and then sugar as well also increased.
Were there any interventions in the course of these 3 years to perhaps mitigate the effects, and was it done equitably? Oftentimes when there's a global crisis, if there's an intervention, the developed economies benefit. Was that the situation in this war?
I would say it was spread across, right? Everyone eventually took a hit in one way or another, right? Because we found ourselves in a situation where it wasn't so easy to equitably reduce the shocks across board, right? So while the advanced economies were feeling the impact of higher LNG prices, which eventually affected their demand and their heating demand and prices of heating for them, and even petrol prices, gasoline prices, in developing economies, you saw more food prices increasing, and also eventually petrol prices. So the shocks were spread across everyone. Some of the interventions, like the Black Sea Grain Initiative, was one of the ones that came on board. But we also did see how that panned out. It was somewhat like a temporary reprieve for some of these markets, and we eventually went back to that shock when Russia withdrew from the initiative.
Are there any chances of prices returning to pre-Russia-Ukraine invasion levels, or we've gone way past that at this point?
I mean, I would say it's going to be unique across different countries, right? Different countries are going to recover in different ways and in different magnitudes. So some countries will recover faster than others. And the reason why I say that is because when you look at the answer to the first question, where majorly was developing and emerging markets that were hard hit by this, you look at the fact that some of these countries right now we're already facing fiscal shocks, right? So right now they're at a position where they're facing reforms and all of that. So case in point, Nigeria, Egypt, look at Cameroon, Ghana. So all of them are going to be eventually they're going to recover on an uneven basis.
Uneven basis, and we'll see where Nigeria falls in all this. Mr. Gideon, Executive Secretary of FEPSAN, let's get into the fertilizer trade in all of this. We know that Russia and its close ally Belarus, they were top exporters of fertilizer as at 2020. How did this war impact the whole fertilizer trade, and have there been any intervention since?
The impact was major, but we had tried to build in resilience for us to be able to, absorb the shock, if you like. The major fertilizers that we rely on from Russia and Belarus is the muriate of potash, and we use that as a raw material for blending fertilizers. Now that consists about 30% of our raw material required for producing NPK blends. Unfortunately, we relied heavily on the Russians to provide potash. But we quickly had to come up with blends, NPK blends, fertilizer blends.
Locally?
Yes, that will be unique to our own agroecology. But more importantly, we were engaging with other producer countries that produce muriate of potash, specifically the Canadians.
Canadians, right.
We have very strong supply agreements with them, and they have been supplying them ever since. But in terms of the immediate impact, not just on the specific fertilizers that we rely on, there was a boomerang or a chain effect on other fertilizers. We saw fertilizers prices go up as high as 400%. Yes, it was that bad.
And that trickled down to food prices, is that right?
Of course, significantly. Fertilizers, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is about 50% of the on-farm input requirement. So immediately the impact is directly felt by our farmers and ultimately by the consumers. But to just the refrain on her last point, we have, particularly for us in the fertilizer industry, we have seen a drop in the pre-Russian crisis prices.
All right,
It's really dropped.
So there has been some adjustments being made, but when it comes to self-sufficiency, I know that crisis like this wakes countries up to become, to some extent, self-sufficient. So how is the local fertilizer industry attempting to do that here in Nigeria?
So we have been very strategic. Like I said, we had tried to build resilience before the war to focus on growing local production. We have 4 primary raw materials and fertilizers that are required. Urea, I don't want to get into it, but we had what was called, and still is, the Presidential Fertilizer Initiative from the Buhari days, which I am a member. And what we do is to try and promote local production and de-emphasize on importing wholesale fertilizers. And that has been very helpful. It's an intervention from government directly that helps us to, through economies of scales, reduce the prices.
We'll have to talk more about this some other time, but let's come to Dr. Ifeanyi, right? I have to include the doctor there. We know that economies and currencies were affected, but Russia, I don't know, their strategy around, they had a lot of sanctions against them. They somewhat were able to fight back and dodge the effect. At some point in 2023, their economy actually grew in the middle of the war. What has been their strategy?
Yeah, so Russia is actually a case study that Nigeria can take a playbook from. It's a situation where you see monetary and fiscal policy working together in order to achieve a goal. Yes, we saw how Russia was taken out of the market, and we saw the impact on the currency, sending the currency to as high as 155. But what happened? We saw that the monetary policy and the fiscal arm started working in tandem in order to bring their currency back to where it was. So aside from fiscal monetary measures of keeping exchange rate where it was supposed to be, they had to take tactical measures like collecting their oil in Russian rubles, which actually gave solid support to their currency, and made different deals that could actually push their economy and promote the actual growth that they are talking about. In fact, it wasn't just about growth. We're talking about capital income. So each individual got richer during the course of the war.
In the middle of a war, and they were it was pretty much them against the world.
Yes, essentially. And another thing to shed your light, given this them against the world scenario, was that this crisis brought a catalyst for other alliances like BRICS. Remember, Nigeria just became partners, but before the war, the catalyst for joining might have not been there, but the fact that the globalization that has been taught was now checkmated by US sanctions, and showing how easily it is for countries that are so connected to be fractionalized, shows that there was need for an alternative. And we could see the price of gold show that.
All right. So, I mean, the price of gold, that brings us to the final question, right? This special is themed Russia-Ukraine war, 3 years in, a needless war, who wins? So what countries, and I'm just going to give 20 seconds to each of you, what countries' assets have won or have benefited from this war one way or the other? Let's begin with you, Dumebi.
I mean, I'll start off from where he dropped off, which is gold. We're seeing a lot of attention towards gold right now. Renewable energy is also one of the big things.
And that's from Europe.
And that's from Europe, Natural gas, it's now being pushed as the transitional fuel just before renewable energy begins to kick off across board globally.
Right.
Then domestically, we're also seeing how there's an increase in regional integration. So conversations around countries working together. The AFCTA is back on track. We're hearing the AFDB push towards this. We're also seeing Russia and China and even Japan looking towards Africa as well. Right?
Okay, interesting. And for you, Mr. Gideon?
Fertilizers and wheat, wheat in particular, is a major staple. Nigeria has been forced to look inwards and grow its capacity. In the last 3 years, we have successfully been increasing our yield per hectare for wheat, which was something we were not aggressive before. That reduces our import dependency.
All right, thank you for that. And finally, Dr. Ifeanyi.
Oh yes, I've already mentioned gold. So next one I would say is the stocks like Lockheed Martin, people that actually produce the weapons that actually fought the war.
Right.
We have seen those particular stocks grow immensely, but now that Trump is back, we have seen it tend.
So there's no upside for those
stocks anymore? There's no upside right now because of the DOGE and efficiency policy that Trump is pushing around.
All right, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure getting insights from each and every one of you. We hope to have you some other time on the show to share more insights on your individual sectors. Of course, a plethora of issues driving commodity prices, and as things progress, we'll get into all that and more. We'll be keeping track of those indices here at News Central. It has been interesting getting into the details, and thank you for joining us on today's special Russia-Ukraine war, 3 years in. A needless war, who wins? I am Joanna Mustapha. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.